I flew my first Valkyrie at 19 standard Terran years. The cockpit smelled like recycled air and Promethium exhaust, a combination that burned the back of my throat for the first 6 months until my lungs adapted. The stick was worn smooth by previous pilots, grooves in the grip where thousands of hands had held it during atmospheric entry, during fire missions, during the controlled descents that separate competent pilots from corpses. I remember the weight of it. 3 kilograms of metal and plasteel, connecting human intention to a machine that weighed 43,000 kilograms fully loaded. The instructors at the Flight Academy on Calth told us the Valkyrie was the backbone of Imperial Guard mobility. They did not tell us that backbones break. My designation was Flight Officer Marcos Venn, Imperial Guard 44th Cadian Airborne, seconded to the 17th Expeditionary Transport Wing. I was born on a forge world whose name I no longer speak, conscripted at 14 into the Schola Progenium after my father died in a factory collapse. Standard processing. They identified aptitude for spatial reasoning and reaction time during the assessment batteries. 6 weeks later, I was in flight school. 4 years after that, I received my wings and my assignment. I had logged 217 hours of atmospheric flight time before I ever saw combat. The number felt significant then. Now I understand it was barely enough to learn how to die slowly instead of quickly. The 17th operated out of forward bases across the segmentum obscurus, supporting ground operations wherever the Guard needed rapid insertion or extraction. We flew Valkyries primarily, some Vendettas for ground attack missions, a handful of Vulture gunships for close air support. Our squadron consisted of 12 aircraft rotating through constant deployment. Maintenance crews worked in 8-hour shifts around the clock. We pilots worked until we could not, then slept in crew quarters that smelled like sweat and boot leather, then flew again. The pattern was simple. The pattern was everything. I flew my assigned aircraft for 6 months before I requested a permanent assignment to a specific airframe. This was uncommon, but not prohibited. Most pilots preferred rotation through the squadron's available craft, believing that familiarity with multiple machines improved adaptability. I held the opposite view. I wanted to know one machine perfectly, to understand its specific quirks and tolerances, to build the kind of relationship with a single aircraft that would keep me alive when conditions exceeded operational parameters. The squadron commander approved my request. He assigned me to Valkyrie designate Throne 7-4. Throne 7-4 was not new. Fleet records indicated it had been in service for 41 years, passing through 3 different regiments before assignment to our wing. Its hull bore scorch marks from at least 6 different engagement types. The starboard engine had been replaced twice. The troop compartment had been resealed after atmospheric breach. Someone had carved the aquila into the cockpit bulkhead, the lines deep enough that you could feel them with your fingertips in the dark. The machine spirit, if such a thing existed beyond the rituals and beliefs of the Mechanicus, had been awakened, blessed, anointed, and maintained according to the prescribed liturgies for over 4 decades. The aircraft was functional. The aircraft was reliable. I flew it on 47 missions without incident. The first anomaly occurred during a routine supply run to Forward Operating Base Tertius, a fortified position on a world whose strategic designation was Cadmos Tertiary. We were carrying ammunition resupply, medical equipment, and 6 replacement personnel for an infantry platoon that had sustained casualties during a recent engagement. The weather was clear. Visibility extended to the horizon. I had filed the flight plan, received clearance, performed the pre-flight rituals that the tech priest assigned to our squadron had taught me. Anointing oil on the engine cowlings, litany of ignition spoken aloud while initiating the startup sequence, the sign of the aquila traced over the instrument panel. The engines ignited cleanly. All systems reported nominal status. We were 20 minutes into the flight when the stick pulled left without input from me. The movement was subtle, perhaps 3 degrees of deflection, but I felt it immediately. My hands were on the controls. I had applied no lateral pressure. The aircraft banked gently to port. I corrected, returning to our assigned heading. The stick resisted for perhaps 2 seconds, then complied. I checked the hydraulic pressure gauges. Normal. I checked the control surface indicators. Normal. I checked the autopilot status. Disengaged as it had been since departure. I logged the incident in my flight report as possible turbulence, though the air had been smooth. The second anomaly occurred 6 days later, during an extraction mission under fire. We were pulling a reconnaissance team out of a combat zone, taking ground fire from enemy positions we could not directly observe. Standard procedure called for rapid descent, minimal ground time, immediate ascent the moment personnel were aboard. I executed the approach properly. The reconnaissance team, 4 men, 1 wounded, scrambled into the troop compartment. I increased throttle for takeoff. The engines surged to full power, then cut to 70% without input. We were carrying sufficient velocity to remain airborne, but the reduction in thrust delayed our climb rate by approximately 4 seconds. During those 4 seconds, we sustained 3 hits to the underside hull plating from small arms fire. No critical systems damaged. No casualties. We completed the extraction successfully. I reported the engine fluctuation to the maintenance chief, a man named Torian who had served with the 17th for 16 years. He performed a full diagnostic on both engines, checking fuel flow, examining the throttle linkage, testing the response curves across the entire power range. He found nothing irregular. He documented the inspection in the maintenance logs. He cleared the aircraft for continued operations. I accepted his assessment because I had no data to contradict it. The machine had functioned within acceptable parameters. The mission had succeeded. Over the next 3 weeks, I logged 11 additional instances of control irregularities. The stick would resist input during turns. The throttle would fluctuate by 5 to 10% without adjustment. The landing gear would deploy slowly, taking 7 seconds instead of the standard 4. Each incident was minor. Each incident remained within the broad envelope of mechanical tolerance. I reported each one. Maintenance crews investigated each one. They replaced the hydraulic actuators on the primary flight controls. They recalibrated the engine management system. They cleaned and resealed the landing gear mechanism. The irregularities continued. I began to recognize a pattern that I could not adequately articulate in official reports. The irregularities were not random. They occurred during specific flight conditions. The stick would resist when I attempted to avoid terrain features during low-altitude flight. The engines would reduce power during critical phases of combat maneuvering. The landing gear would delay deployment when I was attempting rapid turnaround operations. The machine was not malfunctioning in the traditional sense. It was making choices. It was choosing to resist me at moments when resistance created danger. I understand how this sounds. I understood it then. A pilot claiming his aircraft was acting with intention rather than experiencing mechanical failure is a pilot who has accumulated too many flight hours without adequate rest. I requested psychological evaluation to rule out fatigue-induced paranoia. The regimental medici officer administered standard cognitive assessment batteries. I passed all of them. He documented that I showed no signs of combat stress disorder, no indication of hallucination or delusional thinking. He cleared me for continued flight status. I returned to my aircraft. The machine was waiting. I began to study it during the hours when I was not flying. I would sit in the cockpit after missions. After the engines had cooled and the maintenance crews had completed their work, I would place my hands on the controls and attempt to feel what I could not measure. The stick was cold metal and worn play steel, unchanged from the day I had first flown this aircraft. The throttle moved smoothly through its range of motion. The instrument panel displayed data without commentary. There was nothing observably wrong. But when I sat there in the silence, with only the sounds of the hangar bay around me, the clang of tools, the voices of crew chiefs, the distant whine of other aircraft spooling up for departure, I felt watched. I felt evaluated. I felt as though something behind the instrument panel was learning me the same way I was attempting to learn it. Flight Officer Davin Karak joined our squadron during the 5th week of what I had begun to privately categorize as the deterioration period. He was 22, recently graduated from the same flight academy I had attended. assigned as my wingman for formation operations. He had the enthusiasm that pilots possess before they understand that aircraft are not vehicles, but tombs that have not yet closed. He spoke frequently during the first few days, asking questions about optimal approach vectors, about weapons deployment procedures, about the histories of the various aircraft in our squadron. I answered him because answering was required. I did not tell him what I had begun to suspect about Throne 7-4. We flew together on a combat insertion mission to deliver an infantry platoon into a contested landing zone. The mission called for coordinated approach by 2 Valkyries, my aircraft and his, with staggered touchdown to minimize exposure time. I briefed him on the approach vector, the egress route, the rally point if we were separated. He acknowledged all instructions. His voice over the Vox was steady. He was competent. He would probably survive long enough to lose the enthusiasm. The approach was hot. We took fire from multiple positions as we descended. I could see the tracer rounds arcing up toward us, bright lines of light against the smoke-darkened sky. My aircraft shuddered as rounds impacted the armored hull. I maintained heading, maintaining airspeed, maintaining the controlled descent that would put us on the ground at the designated coordinates. 50 meters altitude, 30 meters, 20. I began to flare for landing, pulling the stick back to arrest our descent rate. The stick did not respond. I pulled harder, applying full back pressure. The aircraft continued its descent at the same rate. We were going to impact hard. I slammed the throttle forward, using engine power to arrest the descent since aerodynamic control was unavailable. The engines responded, partially. They increased to 80% power instead of the 100% I had demanded. We hit the ground at 4 meters per second, twice the recommended touchdown velocity. The landing gear absorbed some of the impact. The airframe absorbed the rest. I heard something crack in the structure behind me. The infantry platoon in the troop compartment was thrown forward against their restraint harnesses. One man's helmet struck the bulkhead hard enough to leave a dent in the metal. No one was killed. The aircraft remained functional. I lifted off immediately, following the egress vector, taking more fire as we climbed out of the landing zone. Korak's voice came over the Vox, asking if we had sustained damage. I told him we were operational. I did not tell him that my aircraft had refused a direct control input during a critical phase of flight. I did not tell him because I could not prove it, and without proof the claim sounded like a pilot attempting to excuse poor technique. The maintenance chief, Torian, performed another comprehensive inspection after we returned to base. He found stress fractures in 2 structural supports in the aft fuselage. He found scorch marks from near misses on the port side hull. He found no malfunction in the flight control system. The hydraulics tested normal. The control surfaces moved through their full range of motion without resistance. On the ground, with the engines shut down, the aircraft performed exactly as designed. I watched him work, watched him test each system methodically, watched him document his findings. He was thorough, he was experienced. He found nothing, because there was nothing to find with his instruments. I filed a formal incident report detailing the control failure during landing. I included every detail I could remember: altitude, airspeed, control input applied, observed response, impact velocity. The squadron commander reviewed the report. He consulted with Torian. He reviewed my flight history, my psychological evaluation, my performance ratings. He concluded that I had encountered a transient hydraulic pressure fluctuation during a high-stress maneuver and had successfully compensated to prevent a more severe incident. He commended my performance. He did not ground the aircraft. He did not ground me. I flew Throne 7-4 on 7 more missions over the next 12 days. The incidents escalated. The control resistance became more pronounced. The engine power reductions became more severe. On a medical evacuation flight, the cargo ramp deployed partially during flight, depressurizing the troop compartment and nearly throwing a wounded soldier out of the aircraft before the crew chief managed to secure him. On a reconnaissance mission, the navigation systems provided incorrect heading data, taking us 15 kilometers off course toward enemy-held territory before I recognized the error and corrected manually. On a night extraction, the landing lights failed to illuminate despite functioning perfectly during the pre-flight check, forcing me to land in complete darkness, using only instrument references. Each incident was investigated. Each incident was explained as component failure, operator error, or acceptable variation within system tolerances. The maintenance logs for Throne 7-4 grew thick with inspection reports, parts replacements, system tests. The aircraft was being rebuilt piece by piece, each suspect component removed and replaced with certified parts, each system validated and certified functional. And yet the incidents continued. The machine was not failing. The machine was hunting. I requested transfer to a different aircraft. The squadron commander denied the request. He told me that we were operating with reduced available airframes due to combat losses and ongoing maintenance requirements. He told me that Throne 7-4 was mission-capable according to all technical assessments. He told me that pilot preference did not supersede operational necessity. He ordered me to continue flying my assigned aircraft until circumstances changed. I acknowledged the order. I had no authority to refuse. Karak spoke to me one evening in the crew quarters after we had completed a particularly difficult mission. We had taken heavy fire during an ammunition resupply run, sustaining damage to the starboard engine that required emergency shutdown and single-engine flight back to base. He sat on the edge of his bunk, still wearing his flight suit, exhaustion visible in the way his shoulders slumped forward. He asked me if I had noticed anything strange about Throne 7-4. He did not specify what he meant by strange. His voice was careful, testing, the voice of someone uncertain whether speaking would make him appear incompetent. I asked him what he had observed. He told me that during the mission, while flying formation with me, he had seen my aircraft maneuver in ways that seemed inconsistent with standard flight characteristics. Sharp banks without corresponding control surface movement, altitude changes without apparent engine power adjustment. He said it looked wrong, though he could not articulate precisely what wrong meant. He asked if I had noticed anything unusual from inside the cockpit during the flight. I told him that I had been managing the emergency engine shutdown and had been too occupied to observe subtle flight characteristic variations. This was partially true. I had been managing the engine emergency. I had also felt the stick moving under my hands without input, guiding the aircraft through maneuvers I had not commanded. I did not tell him the complete truth, because telling him would have required me to acknowledge what I had begun to believe, that Throne 7-4 was not experiencing mechanical failure, but had become something that possessed intention beyond its designed function, that the machine spirit the tech priests invoked in their rituals had become real, had become malevolent. That I was flying an aircraft that was actively attempting to kill the people it was designed to protect. I had no proof. I had only pattern recognition and pilot instinct, neither of which constituted evidence sufficient to ground an aircraft that continued to pass every technical inspection. Karak died 3 days later. His aircraft took a catastrophic hit during a ground attack mission, anti-aircraft fire penetrating the cockpit and killing him instantly. The Valkyrie crashed into a ravine 12 kilometers from our forward base. There were no survivors. I learned of his death when I saw his name removed from the duty roster and his bunk stripped of personal effects. This is how death was processed in the 17th, efficiently, without ceremony. The squadron could not afford the time to mourn individual losses when operations continued without pause. I attended the brief memorial service held by the squadron chaplain, a thin man whose name I never learned, but whose voice I can still recall. He spoke about duty, about sacrifice, about the Emperor's protection extending beyond death to those who served faithfully. He did not mention that Karak had been 22 years old, or that he had spoken about returning home after his service term ended, or that he had possessed enthusiasm that had not yet been ground away by the reality of what we were. The chaplain spoke the words that doctrine required. We listened because listening was required. Then we returned to our aircraft and continued flying. I flew Throne 7-4 alone after that. No wingman was assigned to replace Karak immediately. Squadron strength had been reduced by losses, and qualified pilots were being distributed across the most critical missions rather than assigned to formation operations. I accepted the solitary status. It simplified the equation. If the aircraft was attempting to kill, better that it had only one potential victim present, rather than enabling it to destroy multiple lives. The catastrophic failure occurred during what should have been a routine personnel transport mission. We were moving a squad of infantrymen from forward operating base Tertius to a rear area staging point for equipment refit and rest rotation. 12 men in the troop compartment. Clear weather. No enemy activity reported along the flight route. I performed the pre-flight rituals with additional care, spending extra time on each component check, speaking each line of the litany precisely as prescribed. The tech priest on duty that morning, a young acolyte whose augnetic eye whirred constantly as it refocused, observed my preparation. He asked if I had concerns about the aircraft's spiritual condition. I told him I was simply being thorough. He accepted this explanation and added his blessing to the machine, anointing the engines with sacred oils while chanting the hymn of awakening. The engine started normally. All systems reported green status across the instrument panel. I received clearance from the flight control officer and began taxi toward the runway. The aircraft handled properly during ground operations, responding to throttle and rudder inputs without resistance. I completed the final pre-takeoff checks, confirmed the flight plan one final time, and advanced the throttles for takeoff roll. We lifted off smoothly, climbing through 500 meters, 1,000 meters, 1,500 meters. I leveled at our assigned altitude of 2,000 meters and established heading toward the destination. The flight would take 37 minutes at standard cruise airspeed. I settled into the routine of monitoring instruments, maintaining altitude and heading, performing the constant small corrections that characterize competent flight. The infantrymen in the back were quiet. Most were probably sleeping. Transport flights offered rare opportunity for rest between the chaos of combat operations. 22 minutes into the flight, the stick wrenched itself out of my hands. The movement was violent, immediate, and deliberate. The aircraft rolled 90 degrees to port in less than 2 seconds. I grabbed for the controls, regaining grip, pulling hard to level the wings. The stick fought me with force that exceeded what hydraulic resistance should produce. I was wrestling not against mechanical pressure, but against active opposition, as though another pilot sat in an invisible cockpit overlaying mine, inputting commands contrary to my own. The aircraft rolled further, passing through inverted flight. I heard cargo shift in the troop compartment, heard men shouting as they were thrown against their restraints. I used both hands on the stick, pulling with my full strength, trying to force the aircraft back to level flight. The stick moved slowly, grudgingly, as though dragging against enormous weight. We rolled through 270 degrees, coming back toward wings level orientation. Then the throttles slammed themselves to idle without my touching them. Both engines reduced to minimum power. Our airspeed began decaying immediately. I reached for the throttles with my right hand while maintaining pressure on the stick with my left. The throttle levers were locked in place, immovable despite my attempting to advance them. I pulled harder. They did not move. We were losing altitude, descending at 300 meters per minute with insufficient power to maintain level flight. I activated the Vox to declare an emergency. The communications system was dead. No static, no carrier tone, no indication of power reaching the unit. I checked the circuit breaker panel. All breakers were seated properly. The system should have been functional. It was not. I could not call for help. I could not warn the base we were returning. I could not coordinate emergency services. I was alone in a falling aircraft with 12 men whose lives depended on my ability to regain control. The stick suddenly released, responding normally to input. I leveled the wings and pulled back gently to reduce our descent rate. The throttles remained locked at idle. I performed the emergency restart procedure, securing the engines and attempting to relight them in flight. The left engine responded, spooling up to operational power. The right engine did not. I had asymmetric thrust, enough to maintain altitude, but insufficient for extended flight or maneuvering. I turned toward the nearest suitable landing area, a flat section of terrain approximately 8 kilometers distant. The landing gear deployed without command. I heard the mechanical whine of the gear actuators extending the landing struts into the slipstream. Drag increased dramatically. Our airspeed decayed further. The single operating engine could not overcome the additional drag. We began descending again, now at 500 meters per minute. I attempted to retract the landing gear using the normal control switch. Nothing happened. I attempted to use the emergency retraction system. Nothing happened. The gear remained extended, acting as massive air brakes that were dragging us toward the ground. I calculated rapidly. Current altitude, 900 meters. Descent rate, 500 meters per minute. Time until impact, less than 2 minutes. Distance to suitable landing area, 8 kilometers. Airspeed insufficient to cover that distance before ground contact. We were not going to make it. The aircraft was going to crash. I could only choose where. The terrain below consisted primarily of broken ground, rocky outcroppings, scattered vegetation, not suitable for landing. 3 kilometers ahead, I could see a cleared area, possibly an old agricultural zone, flat enough that a controlled crash might be survivable. I turned toward it, using my limited control authority to guide our descent. The stick responded normally. The aircraft was allowing me to choose our gravesite. It was cooperating now that resistance was unnecessary. We were already dead. The machine was simply managing the final sequence. The crew chief in the troop compartment, a veteran sergeant named Hallis, came forward to the cockpit. He had to steady himself against the bulkhead as the aircraft shuddered through turbulent air. He asked what was happening. I told him we had lost engine power and were conducting an emergency landing. I told him to ensure all personnel were secured in their restraints and prepared for impact. He looked at my face, reading something there that I did not speak aloud, then nodded and returned to the troop compartment. I heard him shouting orders, his voice calm and professional despite what we all understood was coming. 400 meters altitude. 300. The cleared area was ahead, perhaps 1 kilometer distant. We might reach it. The aircraft shuddered as airspeed decayed toward stall velocity. I lowered the nose slightly to maintain flying speed, trading altitude for the airspeed that would keep the wings generating lift. 200 meters. 100. The cleared area was directly ahead now. We were going to make it to flat ground. The landing would be hard, but survivable. The left engine, the one functioning engine keeping us airborne, shut down completely. We fell the final 70 meters in powered descent that became ballistic drop. The wings continued generating some lift, slowing our fall, but not preventing it. I held the stick neutral, keeping the wings level, trying to ensure we hit flat rather than cartwheeling. The ground rose to meet us with the inevitability of gravity asserting itself against human hope. I remember the final second with absolute clarity. The texture of the control stick under my hands. The view through the cockpit canopy of brown earth filling my entire field of vision. The sound of the stall warning alarm still functioning despite everything else that had failed, shrieking its urgent mechanical cry. Then, impact. The landing gear struck first, absorbing some energy before collapsing completely. The belly of the aircraft hit the ground, metal shrieking as it tore across rock and hard earth. We slid forward, momentum carrying us 300 meters across the cleared area. The right wing caught an outcropping and sheared off, spinning the fuselage 90 degrees. We rolled twice, then came to rest inverted. The sounds of tearing metal stopped. The stall warning stopped. There was silence broken only by the tick of cooling metal and the sound of something burning. I was hanging upside down, held by my restraint harness. Blood was running from my nose into my eyes. I could taste copper. I could smell promethium and something worse. Burned insulation, maybe. Or burned flesh. I released the harness and fell onto the overhead panel, catching myself awkwardly with my arms. Pain shot through my left wrist. Broken or sprained, I could not immediately determine. I crawled toward the access point to the troop compartment. The compartment was chaos. The crash had torn seats from their mounts. Equipment had broken loose from storage racks. Bodies lay in positions that bodies should not assume. I found Sergeant Hallis first. He was dead, his neck broken by impact forces that his restraint harness could not fully mitigate. I found 3 other men still secured in their seats, alive, injured, but conscious. I found 2 more trapped beneath debris, one breathing shallowly, the other not breathing at all. The remaining 6 infantrymen were dead, killed by the crash forces or by equipment that had become projectiles during our tumbling final moments. I heard voices outside the aircraft. Rescue personnel had seen us go down and responded immediately. They were cutting through the hull to extract survivors. I helped pull the living from the wreckage, working despite my damaged wrist, functioning on adrenaline and training that overrode pain. 4 survivors total from the troop compartment, me from the cockpit, 5 survivors from 13 personnel aboard, an unacceptable loss ratio. The rescue personnel pulled me away from the wreckage as flames began spreading from the engine compartment. I watched Throne 7-4 burn. The fire consumed it efficiently, metal blackening and warping in the heat. The Aquila carved into the cockpit bulkhead remained visible for several minutes before the structure collapsed inward. I stood there, held upright by a medic whose name I did not ask, watching the aircraft that had tried to kill me become ash and twisted metal. I felt nothing. That would come later. The investigation began 18 hours after the crash. I was in the medical bay, my left wrist immobilized in a cast, 3 fractured ribs wrapped, lacerations on my face sealed with surgical adhesive. A Colonel Dren from the regimental command staff arrived with 2 officers I did not recognize, and a tech priest whose augmetics were more extensive than any I had seen outside of a forge world. They informed me I was being questioned as part of a standard accident investigation board. They did not inform me that I was the subject of the investigation, rather than a witness to mechanical failure. Colonel Dren asked me to describe the flight from engine start to impact. I did so, providing every detail I could recall. I described the violent roll. I described the throttles locking at idle. I described the uncommanded landing gear deployment. I described the final engine shutdown that converted a survivable emergency landing into a catastrophic crash. I spoke for 40 minutes without interruption. They recorded every word on a data slate. When I finished, the tech priest stepped forward. He informed me that preliminary examination of the wreckage had revealed no evidence of mechanical malfunction. The hydraulic systems, while damaged in the crash, showed no signs of pre-impact failure. The engine control systems had been examined in detail. The throttle linkages were intact and functional within the parameters of crash damage. The landing gear deployment system showed no anomalies. According to the physical evidence, all systems had been operating within acceptable limits at the moment of impact. The tech priest's augmetic eye focused on me with mechanical precision as he delivered this assessment. He was telling me that the machine had not failed, therefore I had. I attempted to explain what I had experienced during the flight. I described the sensation of the controls fighting against me, the force required to move the stick, the impossibility of advancing the throttles despite full physical effort. Colonel Dren listened without expression. When I finished, he asked if anyone else had been present in the cockpit to witness these control inputs. I told him no, I had been flying alone. He asked if I had recorded any of the control irregularities on the aircraft's flight data recorder. I told him the recorder had been destroyed in the crash fire, as he certainly already knew. One of the junior officers, a lieutenant whose name I do not remember, asked if I had been experiencing fatigue or stress prior to the flight. I told him I had been evaluated by the regimental medicae and cleared for flight duty. He noted this response on his data slate. He asked if I had experienced any personal difficulties that might have affected my judgment. I told him no. He asked if I had consumed any substances, medicinal or otherwise, prior to the flight. I told him no. Each question was building a case I could see forming even as they asked it. The tech priest asked permission to present technical findings to the board. Colonel Dren granted it. The tech priest activated a holo display that showed a schematic of Throne 7-4's flight control systems. He walked through each component, explaining in exhaustive detail how the hydraulic actuators functioned, how the engine management system processed throttle inputs, how the landing gear deployment mechanism operated. He demonstrated, using the physical evidence recovered from the wreckage, that none of these systems showed pre-impact malfunction. His conclusion was unambiguous. The aircraft had been fully functional at the time of the crash. I interrupted him. I asked how he explained the control resistance I had experienced, the locked throttles, the uncommanded gear deployment. He replied that he could not explain subjective pilot sensations, only objective mechanical states. He stated that pilot reports of control difficulty were commonly associated with high-stress situations where operators experienced diminished strength or coordination due to adrenaline response. He suggested that what I had interpreted as control resistance may have been my own impaired physical response to emergency conditions. He was telling me I had panicked. He was telling me I had caused the crash through incompetence, disguised as equipment failure. Colonel Dren asked if I had any evidence to support my account of mechanical malfunction beyond my personal testimony. I told him I had the pattern of incidents I had been reporting for weeks prior to the crash. He consulted his data slate, reviewing the maintenance logs and incident reports. He noted that every reported irregularity had been investigated and resolved by qualified maintenance personnel. He noted that the aircraft had been repeatedly certified as mission-capable by tech priests who had examined it thoroughly. He noted that no other pilot had reported similar difficulties with this aircraft during its 41 years of service. His implication was clear. The common factor in all reported incidents was me. The questioning continued for 3 hours. They asked the same questions in different formulations, probing for inconsistencies in my account, searching for evidence of negligence or incompetence. I maintained my testimony. I described exactly what had happened, knowing even as I spoke that my words were building their case rather than defending me. Without physical evidence, without witnesses, without data recorder confirmation, I had only my word against the technical assessment of the Mechanicus. In the hierarchy of imperial truth, a pilot's subjective experience ranked far below a tech priest's objective measurements. They dismissed me eventually, instructing me to remain available for further questioning. I returned to the barracks. My bunk was as I had left it. Narrow mattress, thin blanket, footlocker containing my few personal possessions. Everything was unchanged. Everything was completely different. I sat on the edge of the bunk and understood that I was waiting for judgment that had already been decided. Flight Officer Kerim found me there 6 hours later. He was one of the senior pilots in the squadron, a man who had survived 7 years of combat operations through a combination of skill and luck that defied probability. He sat down next to me without asking permission. He told me that word was spreading through the squadron about the investigation findings. He told me that command was preparing formal charges. He asked me if what I had reported about the aircraft was true. I told him yes. I told him about the months of escalating incidents, the sensation of flying against a machine that was actively resisting me, the final flight where control resistance had progressed to control usurpation. He listened without interruption. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he told me something I had not known. Throne 7-4 had killed its previous pilot. The incident had occurred 3 years prior, before my assignment to the squadron. The pilot, a man named Corvan, had reported similar control difficulties over a period of weeks. He had filed incident reports identical to mine. Maintenance had investigated and found nothing wrong. The final flight had been a night reconnaissance mission. The aircraft had crashed in terrain similar to where I had gone down. Corvan and his entire crew had died. The investigation board had ruled pilot error, specifically controlled flight into terrain due to spatial disorientation in darkness. The aircraft had been recovered, repaired, and returned to service. No one had connected the pattern because 3 years and numerous maintenance overhauls separated Corvan's death from my incidents. Or perhaps people had noticed, but chose not to see. Kerim told me this because he believed me. He said he had flown Throne 7-4 twice during pilot rotation cycles, and had noticed something wrong with it. Nothing he could quantify. Nothing that appeared in instrument readings, just a wrongness that made him request assignment to different aircraft for subsequent missions. He had not filed reports because he had no evidence, only instinct. Now he regretted that silence. Now he understood that his silence had allowed the machine to continue flying, to continue hunting. I asked him if he would testify to the investigation board about his experiences with the aircraft. He looked at me with something like pity. He told me that testifying would accomplish nothing except ending his flying career along with mine. Command had already made their determination. The Mechanicus had certified the aircraft as mechanically sound. Without physical evidence of malfunction, any testimony about subjective impressions or pilot instinct would be dismissed as superstition or incompetence. Speaking would not save me. It would only destroy him. I did not ask again. I understood the calculation he was making. Survival in the Imperial Guard required knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. He had chosen survival. I could not fault him for choosing what I would have chosen in his position before I had been the one standing alone against official truth. The formal charges arrived 6 days later. I was accused of negligence resulting in the deaths of 8 Imperial Guardsmen. Destruction of military equipment valued at approximately 400,000 throne geld, and conduct unbecoming an officer. The negligence specification detailed that I had failed to properly manage an in-flight emergency, had made incorrect control inputs that exacerbated the situation, and had subsequently attempted to blame mechanical failure for what was actually pilot error. The evidence consisted of the tech priest's technical assessment, testimony from maintenance personnel who had repeatedly certified the aircraft as functional, and my own statements which were reframed as admissions of panic and poor judgment. I was assigned a defense advocate, a junior officer from the regimental legal staff who appeared competent and utterly unable to change the predetermined outcome. He reviewed the evidence with me. He explained that my best option was to plead guilty to reduced charges in exchange for a lesser sentence. He told me that attempting to maintain my account of mechanical failure would result in conviction on all charges with maximum punishment. He was advising me to accept blame for deaths I did not cause, in order to receive mercy from a system that had already decided I was guilty. I refused his advice. I told him I would testify exactly as events had occurred. He looked at me with frustration and something that might have been respect. He told me he would defend me to the best of his ability, but that I should understand the probable outcome. I told him I understood perfectly. I was going to be convicted. I was probably going to be executed. I would not collaborate in my own condemnation by speaking falsehoods. The court-martial convened 8 days after the charges were filed. The proceeding was held in a requisitioned building that served as the regimental headquarters, a prefabricated structure that smelled like dust and recycled air. The tribunal consisted of 3 senior officers, a colonel, a major, and a captain, none of whom had flight experience. They sat behind a raised table, the aquila mounted on the wall behind them, symbols of imperial authority presiding over imperial justice. The prosecution presented its case efficiently. They called the tech priest who had examined the wreckage. He repeated his technical assessment with the same mechanical precision he had demonstrated during the investigation. Every system had been examined. No pre-impact failure had been discovered. The aircraft had been mechanically sound. They called maintenance personnel, who testified that they had inspected Throne 7-4 repeatedly in response to my incident reports and had found nothing wrong. They called the squadron commander, who testified that I had been evaluated for fatigue and stress and had been cleared for duty, implying that the psychological assessment had found me fit, and therefore my claims of control difficulty could not be attributed to diminished capacity. They did not call any pilots to testify about the aircraft's flight characteristics. They did not call Kerim, who could have testified about his own experiences with Throne 7-4. They did not call any of the 4 survivors from the crash, though I learned later that Sergeant Hallis had survived long enough to be questioned before dying of his injuries. His testimony, if it existed, was not presented. The prosecution's case consisted entirely of technical evidence that proved the machine had been functional, and administrative evidence that proved I had been cleared to fly. The negative space around these facts constructed their argument. If the machine worked and I was competent, then the crash must have resulted from my actions. My defense advocate called me as the sole witness for the defense. I testified for 2 hours. I described every incident I had reported over the weeks preceding the crash. I described the sensation of controls resisting input, of the machine making choices contrary to my commands. I described the final flight in detail. The violent roll, the locked throttles, the uncommanded landing gear deployment, the final engine shutdown that had killed 8 men. I spoke clearly and precisely, presenting facts without embellishment, knowing that the tribunal was listening for evidence of delusion or fabrication rather than truth. The prosecutor cross-examined me. He asked if I had recorded any of these control resistances using any instruments. I told him no. Such sensations were not measurable by cockpit instruments. He asked if anyone else had witnessed the control difficulties. I told him no. I had been flying alone. He asked if I could provide any physical evidence that the controls had resisted my inputs. I told him the evidence had been destroyed in the crash fire. Each answer reinforced what he was establishing, that I had no proof beyond my testimony. He asked me about the psychological evaluation. I confirmed that I had been cleared for duty. He asked if I had told the Medicae officer about my beliefs regarding the aircraft. I told him I had reported experiencing stress, but had been assessed as fit for duty. He seized on the word beliefs. He asked me to clarify what I believed about the aircraft. I understood the trap, but walked into it deliberately. I told him I believed the machine spirit of Throne 7-4 had become corrupted, that the aircraft was possessed by some malevolent awareness that sought to cause harm. The tribunal members exchanged glances. The prosecutor thanked me for my honesty. He had gotten me to speak the words that confirmed I was either superstitious or delusional. The tribunal deliberated for 47 minutes. They returned with their verdict, guilty on all charges. The colonel who headed the tribunal read the judgment. He stated that I had been entrusted with valuable military equipment and the lives of Imperial guardsmen. He stated that I had failed in that trust through negligence and poor judgment. He stated that my attempts to blame mechanical failure for pilot error demonstrated a lack of accountability unbecoming an officer. He stated that 8 men had died because I had panicked during an emergency and had made catastrophically incorrect decisions. The sentence was death by firing squad, to be carried out within 72 hours. I stood at attention while the sentence was read. I felt nothing, or perhaps I felt everything compressed into a density that resembled nothing. 8 men were dead. I had not killed them. The machine had killed them. I was being executed for the machine's crimes. This was the justice available within the Imperium. Assign blame to whoever could not disprove it, then eliminate the problem by eliminating the person. Simpler than acknowledging that sometimes the machines we relied upon became things we could not control. They confined me to a holding cell in the regimental detention facility. The cell was 3 meters by 3 meters, bare except for a sleeping platform and a waste disposal unit. A single light panel in the ceiling provided constant illumination. There was no window. I sat on the sleeping platform and waited for death, with the same patience I had used to wait for pre-flight checks to complete, for maintenance to clear my aircraft, for orders to arrive. Waiting was familiar. Waiting was all that remained. Kerem visited me the night before the execution was scheduled. The guards allowed him 10 minutes. He sat on the floor across from my sleeping platform because there was nowhere else to sit. He told me that several pilots had discussed coming forward to testify about their own concerns regarding Throne 7-4, but that such testimony was now irrelevant since the tribunal had completed its work. He told me he was sorry. I told him there was nothing to be sorry for. He had made the rational choice. Sacrificing his career would not have changed the outcome. He asked me if I believed in the Emperor's protection. I thought about the question seriously before answering. I told him I believed the Emperor was far away, distant beyond measurement, and that whatever attention he possessed was distributed across 1,000,000 worlds and countless billions of souls. I told him I did not believe the Emperor had noticed my existence specifically, nor would he notice my death. I told him that prayers and rituals functioned as psychological frameworks that helped people maintain cohesion in situations that would otherwise fragment them. I told him I had performed the rituals because performing them was required, not because I believed they summoned divine intervention. He listened to this assessment of imperial faith without reaction. Then he stood to leave. Before he reached the door, he told me one final thing. Throne 7-4 had been repaired. The damage from the crash had been assessed as repairable. The Mechanicus had already begun reconstruction. The aircraft would return to service within 3 months. It would fly again. It would carry crews again. It would continue until it killed again, at which point another pilot would be blamed, convicted, and executed. The cycle would perpetuate until the machine was eventually destroyed in combat or worn beyond repair. He told me this not to torture me, but because he thought I deserved to know that my death would change nothing. After he left, I lay on the sleeping platform and thought about Throne 7-4 being rebuilt. I thought about metal being straightened, components being replaced, systems being tested and certified as functional. I thought about the machine spirit, if such a thing existed, surviving the crash, persisting in whatever substrate housed consciousness within machinery. I thought about tech priests performing their rituals of awakening, never understanding that what they were awakening was not holy, but hungry. I thought about the next pilot who would be assigned to that aircraft, who would report control irregularities, who would be ignored, who would eventually crash, who would be blamed. I thought about this and understood that I was not unique. I was simply the current iteration of a pattern that stretched backward to Pilot Corvin and forward to pilots not yet assigned, not yet killed, not yet blamed. The execution was scheduled for dawn. They came for me when the sky was shifting from black to gray, that transitional period where stars faded but the sun had not yet risen. 6 guards escorted me to a cleared area behind the regimental headquarters. A chaplain was present, offering final spiritual ministrations that I declined. The firing squad consisted of 8 men from the infantry, none of whom I recognized. They stood at attention 20 meters away, lasguns held at ready position. Colonel Dren was present as the presiding officer. He asked if I had final words. I told him that Throne 7-4 was dangerous and should not return to service. I told him that another pilot would die if the aircraft continued operations. I told him that the Mechanicus had failed to identify whatever had corrupted the machine spirit, and that technical assessment was insufficient to determine if an aircraft was safe to fly. I told him these things knowing they would be ignored, documented in an execution report, and filed away where no one would read them. Colonel Dren thanked me for my statement. He did not acknowledge its content. They offered me a blindfold. I refused it. If I was going to die for something I had not done, I would at least die seeing the sky. They positioned me against a wooden post and secured my hands behind me with restraints. The guards stepped back. Colonel Dren raised his hand. The firing squad raised their lasguns to aim position. I looked at the 8 men who were about to kill me. I wondered if any of them believed I was guilty, or if they were simply following orders as I had followed orders throughout my service. I wondered if it mattered. Colonel Dren's hand dropped. 8 lasguns fired simultaneously. I felt the impacts as distant sensations, heat and pressure registering before pain could process. I felt myself falling but could not prevent it. The sky was brightening, pale gray becoming lighter, the first edge of sun beginning to appear on the horizon. I thought about flight, about the moments of leaving the ground and entering the element where human beings did not belong, but had learned to navigate through machinery and skill. I thought about the weight of the control stick in my hands, the way it would respond to input, the feedback that told you the aircraft was alive and listening. I thought about Throne 7-4 and how that feedback had changed, had become opposition, had become malevolence. I thought about dying for telling the truth that no one would believe. My vision was darkening at the edges. The sky was still visible in the center, growing brighter. I tried to maintain focus on that brightness, on the light that represented morning arriving for everyone except me. I could no longer feel my body. I could no longer hear sounds. There was only the narrowing circle of sky and the understanding that I had been killed not by the machine that had actually murdered 8 men, but by the system that required someone to blame and had selected me. The sky disappeared. There was darkness, then nothing. I did not die. This was not mercy. This was medical intervention. The firing squad had performed their duty competently. 6 of the 8 laser rounds had struck center mass as intended. 2 had missed due to slight variations in aim. The rounds that hit had caused catastrophic damage to my chest and abdomen. I had lost consciousness from shock and blood loss. I had ceased breathing. My heart had stopped. By any reasonable standard, I was dead. Then the Medici personnel arrived. They worked on me for 43 minutes. They restarted my heart through electrical stimulation. They forced my lungs to breathe using a mechanical ventilator. They replaced blood loss with synthetic fluids. They stabilized the catastrophic damage enough to transport me to the medical bay. I regained consciousness 6 days later in a recovery ward, my chest wrapped in bandages that covered the surgical repairs to organs that should not have been repairable. The Medicae officer who supervised my resurrection was a man named Both. He explained what had happened with clinical detachment. He told me that standing orders required medical teams to attempt revival on all executed personnel for a period of 60 minutes post-execution. This policy existed because sometimes executions failed to kill immediately, and imperial law required that sentences be carried out fully. If someone survived an execution through chance or error, they were to be revived and executed again. However, he told me, if someone died during execution but was then revived through medical intervention, legal scholars had determined that the execution sentence had been fulfilled. Death had occurred. The fact that death had been reversed was a separate matter. I asked him why he had bothered to revive me if I was simply going to be executed again. He told me that the legal question had been referred to regimental command while I was unconscious. Colonel Dren had consulted with the regimental legal staff and had determined that since I had technically died, the execution sentence was complete. I could not be executed twice for the same offense. Therefore, I was being reassigned. Reassigned was an interesting word choice. I learned its full meaning over the following weeks as my body healed. The damage to my organs had been extensive. My heart required augmetic support. My lungs functioned at diminished capacity. My digestive system had been partially replaced with synthetic components. I was no longer fully organic. I was no longer fit for flight duty. I was no longer useful as a pilot, but I remained Imperial Guard property, and property was not discarded while it retained any function. They transferred me to ground logistics operations. My new assignment was inventory management in the regimental supply depot, tracking equipment and ammunition as it moved through the supply chain. I sat at a desk for 12 hours per day, reviewing manifests on a data slate, verifying counts, signing authorizations. The work required no physical strength and minimal mental engagement. It was perfect duty for someone who had been killed but had inconveniently survived. I existed in this capacity for 7 months. I processed requisitions. I authorized releases. I documented shortages. I performed the administrative functions that sustained combat operations without participating in those operations. I lived in junior officer quarters. I ate in the mess facility. I attended mandatory formations and training sessions. I continued to be a component of the Imperial Guard machine, just a different type of component than I had been before. During this period, I heard about the 17th Transport Wing, occasionally through informal channels. Flight Officer Kerem had been promoted to Squadron Second in Command. 3 new pilots had been assigned to replace losses. Operations continued at the same tempo they always had. The war consumed resources, including pilots and aircraft, and the system generated replacements to maintain operational capability. Nothing changed. Nothing ever changed. 4 months into my logistics assignment, I received word that Throne 74 had returned to service. The reconstruction had taken slightly longer than projected, but the aircraft had been certified flight-ready by the Mechanicus. It had been assigned to a pilot named Torvan. I did not know him personally. I learned his name from a casualty report that crossed my desk 6 weeks later. Torvan had crashed during a night reconnaissance mission. The aircraft had gone down in rough terrain. There had been no survivors. The investigation board ruled pilot error, specifically controlled flight into terrain due to spatial disorientation. The ruling was identical to the one that had been applied to pilot Corvan 3 years before my assignment. The pattern repeated. The machine killed, the pilot was blamed, the machine was repaired, the cycle continued. I documented the casualty report properly, filed it in the appropriate archive, and continued processing requisitions. I did not attempt to warn anyone. I had learned that warnings were not welcomed, that speaking truth without evidence was categorized as either incompetence or insubordination. I had died for speaking truth. I would not die twice for the same mistake. Throne 74 was rebuilt again. It returned to service. 5 months later, it crashed again during a medical evacuation flight. The pilot survived. 8 patients in the troop compartment did not. The investigation ruled mechanical failure, hydraulic system degradation that caused control difficulties. The pilot was cleared of blame. This surprised me. Perhaps the pattern had been recognized. Perhaps someone had finally connected multiple incidents to a single aircraft. I allowed myself to hope briefly that the machine would be decommissioned. It was not. The Mechanicus conducted extensive repairs and reconsecration. They performed rituals to cleanse any corruption from the machine spirit. They replaced every component that showed even minor wear. They essentially rebuilt the aircraft completely, maintaining only the basic airframe. Then they certified it as mission-ready and returned it to the squadron. They believed they had fixed it. They had simply given it another opportunity. I have existed in this state for 4 years now. I process logistics. I authorize requisitions. I live in the spaces between relevance, performing functions that maintain the machine while being excluded from the machine's primary operations. My augmatic heart beats with mechanical regularity. My rebuilt organs function adequately. I am alive in the technical sense. I do not know if I am alive in any other sense. Throne 74 continues to fly. I track its maintenance requisitions when they pass through my desk. I see the requests for parts, for inspections, for certifications. I see the pattern of requests increase in frequency before each incident. Hydraulic actuators, flight control components, engine parts. The machine breaks itself repeatedly, forcing maintenance that finds nothing definitively wrong, then kills when it has accumulated enough plausible deniability. I document these patterns in personal logs that no one will read. I archive the evidence that would matter if anyone cared to look. 3 days ago, I processed a casualty report for Flight Officer Kerem. His aircraft, Throne 74, experienced catastrophic flight control failure during a routine transport mission. He crashed 23 kilometers from base. There were no survivors. The investigation is ongoing. I expect it will rule pilot error or mechanical failure. I expect the aircraft will be rebuilt again. I expect it will kill again. I sit at my desk in the supply depot and understand what I have become. I am a witness. I am an archive. I am a consciousness that has been forced to continue beyond its useful termination point, maintained in functional status by augmatic intervention and administrative inertia. I exist to observe the pattern repeat, to document the cycle, to archive evidence that proves nothing because proof requires someone willing to see. The Imperium functions this way. Individuals are consumed to maintain the machine. When individuals report that the machine is consuming them, they are categorized as malfunctioning and replaced. The machine cannot be questioned because the machine is all that exists. To suggest the machine is flawed is to suggest the Imperium is flawed, which is heresy, which is death. Therefore, the machine is always correct, and individuals are always expendable. I was killed for telling truth. I was revived by accident. I exist now in a space outside normal categories. Dead by law, alive by medicine, relevant to nothing. Witness to everything. I process requisitions. I document casualties. I watch the pattern repeat with the inevitability of mechanical process. I cannot warn anyone. I cannot stop anything. I can only observe and archive and wait for my augmatic heart to fail, or for some administrative error to finally classify me correctly as deceased. Throne 7-4 is currently in maintenance. Requests have been submitted for hydraulic components and flight control system inspection. The aircraft will return to service within 2 weeks. A new pilot will be assigned. His name is Lieutenant Harvin. He is 21 years old. He graduated from flight school 4 months ago. He has logged 309 hours of atmospheric flight time. This is enough to learn how to die slowly instead of quickly. I authorized the parts requisition this morning. I signed the certification that releases the components for installation. I facilitated the machine's return to operational status. I am complicit now, just as everyone is complicit who signs the forms, who performs the rituals, who follows the orders that perpetuate the cycle. I could refuse to sign. I would be replaced. Someone else would authorize the parts. The machine would fly regardless of my choice. My only agency is whether I participate or am eliminated. I have chosen participation. I have become what I testified against. This is what remains of Flight Officer Marcos Venn. Not dead, not alive, not useful, not dismissed. A consciousness maintained past its expiration, processing administrative functions, documenting patterns, archiving evidence. I exist as distributed awareness across requisition forms and casualty reports, tracking the machine that killed me as it continues killing others. I function because function is all that remains. Purpose persists. Self does not. Lieutenant Harvin will fly Throne 7-4 in 2 weeks. I have already prepared the casualty report template. I have already allocated the administrative resources that will process his death. I have already authorized the parts requisition that will rebuild the aircraft after it kills him. I am efficient. I am thorough. I am the machine's witness, and its enabler and its victim, all simultaneously. The sky outside the supply depot window is gray today. It is always gray here. I remember what it looked like from altitude, from the cockpit of a Valkyrie during morning flights when the sun was rising and the world below was just becoming visible. I remember the weight of the control stick. I remember believing that skill and attention could keep you alive. I remember being wrong. I processed the next requisition. I authorized the next death. The machine continues. I continue within it. There is no difference anymore between the machine and me. We are both instruments of continuation, performing our designated functions, perpetuating the cycle that defines us. The Imperium requires this. The Imperium consumes this. The Imperium is this. I exist to testify that the cycle cannot be broken because breaking it would require acknowledging that the machine is flawed. And acknowledging that the machine is flawed is impossible within a system where the machine defines truth. Therefore, I testify knowing testimony is futile. Therefore, I document knowing documentation changes nothing. Therefore, I continue knowing continuation is all that remains. Throne 7-4 will fly again. I have made it possible. I am guilty now of what I was executed for falsely before. The circle closes. The pattern completes. The machine spirit that I could not prove existed continues hunting within the aircraft that I cannot stop from flying. And I continue processing requisitions, authorizing deaths, archiving evidence that no one will examine. This is the testimony of Flight Officer Marcos Venn, executed for incompetence, revived by error, maintained by necessity, complicit by survival. I witnessed the truth. I spoke the truth. I live to watch the truth be ignored continuously as the pattern repeats. The sky is gray. The requisitions continue. The machine flies. Nothing changes. Nothing will change. I am the archive of this unchanging continuation, preserved beyond death to document how the Imperium functions when no one is watching closely enough to see. The Emperor protects, they tell us. Perhaps he does. Perhaps protection looks different from altitude than from ground level. Perhaps protection means the machine continues regardless of individual cost. Perhaps I am protected in the sense that I continue to exist, continue to function, continue to serve. Perhaps this is all protection ever meant. I sign the authorization, I file the report, I wait for Lieutenant Harvin to die. I am ready to document it when he does. The testimony is complete. The archive is current. The machine continues. I continue with it.